It's funny how you can live in a house full of people and still feel invisible. For as long as I can remember, that's exactly what my life felt like. Being the youngest of three girls in our suburban Minnesota home wasn't as glamorous as it might sound. My sisters, Jessica and Ashley, seemed to take up all the space, not just physically but emotionally, mentally, and, most importantly, in the eyes of our parents. Jessica was the overachiever. Valedictorian in high school, full-ride scholarship to a prestigious university, and now working some high-profile job in finance that made my dad's chest puff out every time he mentioned it. Then there was Ashley, the artsy one. She could paint, sculpt, and play the piano like a prodigy. Mom adored her creative spirit and would spend hours gushing about her latest masterpiece. And then there was me, Lily, the afterthought. I wasn't brilliant or artistic. I wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention or made people proud. I was just there trying not to take up too much space. In a way, I'd learned to be invisible because it hurt less than being noticed only to be compared. If Jessica was the sun and Ashley was the moon, then I was barely a flickering candle in the background. My earliest memories of feeling out of place started around the age of 7. Jessica had just won some regional science fair, and the house buzzed with excitement. Balloons, a homemade cake, and relatives piling in to celebrate her brilliance. I remember standing in the corner of the living room, clutching a drawing I'd made in school that day. It was a crude crayon sketch of our family, everyone smiling, holding hands. I thought it was good enough to show Mom, maybe even hang on the fridge. But when I tried to hand it to her, she barely glanced at it before patting my head and telling me to run along. Moments like that piled up over the years, tiny bricks building the wall between me and the rest of my family. I started learning to keep to myself. When I was 8, I taught myself how to braid my hair because Mom was too busy helping Ashley finish a painting for some art contest. At 9, I stopped asking for help with homework because Dad would always compare me to Jessica, how she never needed anyone to explain algebra to her. By the time I hit middle school, I'd mastered the art of self-sufficiency. No one seemed to notice. Birthdays were the worst. Jessica's 16th birthday was a spectacle. She got a car, a shiny red one no less, and the entire neighborhood seemed to be at the party. For Ashley's, Mom threw a gallery-style event where her paintings were displayed like treasures in a museum. When my turn came, it was a store-bought cake and a dinner at a chain restaurant where the waiter sang an off-key happy birthday. No one even brought a camera. It wasn't just the big moments. It was the little things that made the resentment grow. The way Mom and Dad's faces lit up when Jessica talked about her latest promotion, or how Ashley could doodle on a napkin and it would end up framed in the hallway. My accomplishments, if you could even call them that, were met with polite smiles and lukewarm praise. I could bring home a report card with all A's, and it would barely register. I remember once overhearing Mom on the phone with a friend. She was bragging about Jessica's internship and Ashley's upcoming art show. When the friend must have asked about me, Mom hesitated before saying something like, "Oh, Lily's doing fine. She's finding her way." That's all I'd ever been to them. A footnote in the grand story of our family. It wasn't that I didn't love my sisters. I did, in my own complicated way. But loving them didn't erase the bitterness that settled in my chest whenever they walked into a room and the air shifted, as if they were the only ones who mattered. It didn't stop the sting of knowing that I could disappear, and it might take my parents days to notice. By the time I hit high school, I'd resign myself to my role in the family. The invisible one, the shadow. I stopped trying to compete, stopped hoping for some grand gesture of love or recognition. Instead, I found solace in solitude. I'd retreat to my room with a book or a journal, places where I could be myself without judgment. If no one else wanted to see me, then I'd learn to see myself. But even in my quiet corner of the house, I couldn't escape the feeling of being an outsider looking in. Family dinners were the worst. Jessica and Ashley dominated the conversation, their voices overlapping as they shared their latest triumphs. Mom and Dad hung on every word, their faces glowing with pride. I sat at the edge of the table, pushing peas around my plate, wishing I could just disappear entirely. The resentment festered, twisting into something darker as I got older. It wasn't just jealousy anymore. It was a deep, aching loneliness that I couldn't shake. I'd watch my family from the sidelines, wondering what was so wrong with me that I didn't deserve the same love and attention. The worst part was that I knew I'd never get an answer. To them, I wasn't worth questioning. Looking back, it's hard to pinpoint when I stopped feeling like part of the family and started feeling like a ghost. Maybe it was always that way, and I just didn't notice until I was old enough to understand. What I do know is that being invisible in your own home does something to you. It changes the way you see yourself and the world. And it's not something you can ever really shake. Teenage years are supposed to be about finding yourself, forming friendships, and maybe even a little rebellion. For me, they became about sacrifice. Jessica and Ashley, who had once been the golden children basking in the glow of parental adoration, began carving out lives of their own. Jessica married young, her husband equally ambitious, and Ashley followed suit not long after, tying the knot with a fellow artist. Before I knew it, I was an aunt, twice over by the time I turned 16. And that was when my life took a sharp turn. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Mom would call me to the living room to entertain Jessica's baby, while she and Dad chatted with her about work. Then Ashley needed help one Saturday because she had a gallery showing, and her husband was out of town. By the time I realized what was happening, my weekends were no longer my own. They were monopolized by unpaid babysitting marathons, where I became the default caregiver for my sister's children. I didn't mind helping at first. I loved my nieces and nephews. Holding their tiny hands and watching them giggle made me feel needed in a way I'd never experienced before. But love doesn't erase exhaustion, and it doesn't cancel out the frustration of being taken for granted. The requests turned into demands. "Lily, you're not busy, are you?" became a familiar refrain. My plans didn't matter. My dreams didn't matter. If Jessica and Ashley needed help, it was expected that I would drop everything and step in. The worst part was the guilt. Any attempt to assert my boundaries was met with thinly veiled accusations of selfishness. I remember one argument vividly. I'd finally worked up the courage to tell Mom that I had plans with friends and couldn't babysit that weekend. She gave me a look that instantly made me feel about 2 inches tall. She reminded me that Jessica and Ashley were doing important things with their lives, raising families, building careers. "Family helps family," she said, her tone heavy with disappointment. "We all pitched in when you were little." The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd never asked for that help. I'd barely even received it. So I gave in. Again and again. My weekends turned into a revolving door of diaper changes, storybooks, and cleaning up spilled juice. I'd sit on the floor of Ashley's cluttered living room, trying to keep her toddler from sticking crayons in the electrical sockets, and wonder if this was all my life would ever be. A perpetual caregiver, sacrificing my own needs and desires for the sake of others. But deep down, a part of me refused to accept that fate. It started as a quiet rebellion, almost imperceptible at first. I threw myself into school, pouring every ounce of energy I had left into my studies. If my family wouldn't see me, maybe my teachers would. Maybe the world outside of this suffocating household would. Excelling in school became my escape plan. I knew that if I wanted a life of my own, I'd have to fight for it. I stayed up late into the night, hunched over textbooks and assignments, while the rest of the house slept. Every A on a test felt like a tiny victory, a small step closer to freedom. I started fantasizing about college, a place far enough away that my family couldn't guilt-trip me into coming home every weekend to babysit. Of course, the guilt wasn't limited to my parents. Jessica and Ashley had their own ways of roping me back in. Jessica's strategy was flattery. She'd tell me how grateful she was, how she didn't know what she'd do without me. And Ashley? She played the nostalgia card. She'd remind me of how we used to play together as kids, how she'd braid my hair and let me borrow her art supplies. But none of that erased the fact that they saw me less as a sister and more as a convenient solution to their problems. By the time I hit senior year, the resentment had grown into a quiet, burning rage. I'd perfected the art of smiling through gritted teeth, nodding along as my family praised Jessica's latest promotion or Ashley's new gallery exhibit, all while my achievements barely warranted a passing mention. I'd become so good at suppressing my anger that even I almost believed I was okay with it all. Almost. The pivotal moment came one particularly chaotic Saturday. Jessica had dropped her kids off at our house because her husband had a work emergency, and Ashley showed up an hour later, frazzled and apologetic, needing someone to watch her toddler. Mom was out running errands, and Dad had conveniently disappeared into his workshop. That left me juggling 3 kids under the age of 5. When Mom finally came home, she breezed past the chaos, calling out a half-hearted "Thanks, Lily," before disappearing into the kitchen. Something inside me snapped. I didn't say anything. I'd learned long ago that words wouldn't get me anywhere. Instead, I channeled my frustration into determination. That night, after the kids were finally asleep and the house was quiet, I sat down at my desk and mapped out a plan. Scholarships, applications, essays. I would leave this place and I wouldn't look back. It wasn't just about escaping anymore. It was about proving, to myself more than anyone else, that I was capable of more than being the family's go-to babysitter. I wanted a life where I wasn't invisible, where my achievements were celebrated instead of overlooked. And for the first time in years, I felt a spark of hope. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't be here. The acceptance letter from the University of California, Los Angeles, felt like the lifeline I'd been desperately clinging to. It came on a gray spring afternoon, tucked into a plain white envelope with no fanfare. But the moment I read the words, "Congratulations, you've been accepted," my chest swelled with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. This wasn't just an escape plan anymore, it was real. For the first time, I saw a future where I wasn't confined to the walls of my family's expectations. Mom and Dad's reaction was lukewarm, as I'd expected. Dad muttered something about how it was far away, and Mom asked if I'd thought about staying closer to home. Jessica and Ashley, predictably, made it about themselves. Jessica reminisced about her own college days, dropping not-so-subtle hints about how much she'd struggled balancing school and life. Ashley chimed in with concerns about who would help with the kids when I was gone. Their words washed over me like background noise. None of it mattered. I was leaving. The real surprise came from Grandma Linda. She'd always been a quiet presence in my life, someone who stayed on the fringes of family gatherings and avoided the drama that seemed to swirl around our household. But when she heard about my acceptance, her eyes lit up in a way I'd never seen before. She pulled me aside that evening and pressed a small, folded check into my hand. "For your dorm supplies," she said with a conspiratorial smile. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was enough to buy bedding, a few dishes, and maybe some new clothes. More importantly, it was the first time someone had shown they believed in me. Leaving home felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating cloak. The drive to California was long, but every mile felt like a step toward freedom. When I arrived on campus, the chaos of move-in day was exhilarating. My dorm room was tiny, with cinder block walls and a lumpy mattress, but to me, it was paradise. For the first time, I had a space that was entirely mine. No kids crying in the background, no sisters bursting in with demands, no guilt hanging over my head. The transition to college life was surprisingly smooth. I threw myself into my classes, savoring the uninterrupted study time and the intellectual challenge that high school had never provided. I joined a study group for my biology class and found myself bonding with people who saw me as more than just someone's little sister or babysitter. We stayed up late in the library, quizzing each other and laughing over bad coffee. For the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Simple things brought me immense joy. Walking across campus to the sound of students chatting and the hum of skateboard wheels. Eating lunch in the quad without feeling like I needed to rush back home. Even grocery shopping felt like an adventure. I never realized how much I craved independence until I had it. And I wasn't about to let anyone take it away. But the holidays loomed like a dark cloud. By November, the texts and calls from home had started trickling in. Mom wanted to know when I'd be flying back. Jessica hinted that she'd need help with her kids while she prepared Thanksgiving dinner. Ashley, predictably, asked if I'd babysit for her Black Friday shopping spree. I avoided committing to anything, but the pressure was mounting. I couldn't ignore the guilt that tugged at me every time I thought about saying no. Grandma Linda's voice echoed in my head. She told me to stand up for myself, to prioritize my own dreams. But years of conditioning aren't easy to shake. The thought of facing my family's disappointment made my stomach churn. When I finally boarded the plane back to Minnesota, I felt like I was walking into a trap. The moment I stepped through the door, the old pattern snapped back into place. Mom handed me a list of errands she needed help with. Dad muttered something about shoveling the driveway. Jessica and Ashley had already filled my schedule with babysitting duties. It was like I'd never left. But something had changed. I wasn't the same Lily who had quietly shouldered every burden without complaint. College had given me a glimpse of what life could be like when I prioritized myself. And I wasn't about to give that up. That realization hit me one evening as I sat in the living room, surrounded by the chaos of my nieces and nephews. Jessica was chatting with Mom in the kitchen, and Ashley was scrolling through her phone. None of them seemed to notice how exhausted I was, how much I didn't want to be there. That night, I lay awake in my old room, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the future. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between my own needs and my family's expectations. Something had to give. I didn't know exactly how I'd confront them, but I knew it was time. I wasn't just going to survive the holidays. I was going to stand up for myself once and for all. Christmas morning arrived like a storm, with its usual flurry of wrapping paper, laughter, and the screeching chaos of too many children under one roof. The house, already bursting at the seams, became a carnival of noise as aunts, uncles, cousins, and extended family poured in with armloads of gifts and casseroles. I could feel the tension knotting in my chest even before breakfast was over. The expectations hung heavy in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. By mid-morning, the inevitable happened. Jessica cornered me in the kitchen, her two kids hanging off her arms like accessories. She needed someone to watch them while she helped Mom with the turkey. Before I could respond, Ashley chimed in from the doorway, cradling her crying toddler. It was a tag-team effort, a well-practiced maneuver I'd fallen for countless times before. But not this time. I took a deep breath, my heart hammering as I spoke the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks. I couldn't help. I had plans to relax and spend time with Grandma Linda. The room went silent for a moment, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Jessica's smile faltered, and Ashley's brow furrowed in confusion. Then came the guilt. Jessica started first, her voice dripping with practiced martyrdom. She talked about how hard it was to balance everything, how much she relied on family to keep things running smoothly. Ashley followed with her usual nostalgia routine, reminding me of all the times she'd been there for me when I was younger. Even Mom joined in, her disappointment cutting through the air like a knife. "Family helps family," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I refused again, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. The shock on their faces was almost comical, as if they couldn't fathom the idea of me saying no. But their disbelief quickly morphed into anger and judgment. The rest of the day was a minefield of tense conversations and passive-aggressive comments. At lunch, Jessica made a point of mentioning how some people didn't understand the value of family. Ashley's husband offered to help with the kids, but only after making a snide remark about how it shouldn't be his responsibility. Even Dad, usually indifferent to household dramas, muttered something about how I'd changed since going to college. It all came to a head at dinner. The table was a spectacle of Christmas abundance, piled high with roasted meats, steaming vegetables, and an array of desserts. But the tension was thicker than the gravy. As the meal progressed, I could feel the weight of everyone's judgment pressing down on me. Finally, I snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't throw my chair back or storm out dramatically. I simply set down my fork and began to speak. I talked about how I'd spent years sacrificing my time, my energy, and my dreams to meet their endless expectations. How their constant demands had made me feel like a servant rather than a sister or daughter. How I'd finally realized that my life was worth more than being their fallback plan. The room was silent by the time I finished. Mom's face was a mixture of shock and hurt, while Jessica and Ashley looked like I'd slapped them. Grandma Linda, seated at the far end of the table, gave me the smallest nod of approval. It was all the encouragement I needed. I stood, my hands shaking but my resolve firm, and excused myself from the table. As I walked to my room to pack, I could hear the murmurs and whispers start up behind me. But for once, I didn't care what they thought. I had done what I needed to do. That night, as I sat on the plane back to California, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known before. My phone buzzed incessantly with texts and missed calls from my family, but I didn't bother reading them. One by one, I blocked their numbers. For the first time in years, I felt free. Truly free. The first weekend back at the university felt like stepping into a sanctuary. My dorm room, with its mismatched furniture and faint scent of instant noodles, was a haven of peace. For the first time in years, I had a holiday weekend without chaos, without babysitting, without guilt. I spent those days curled up with textbooks and notebooks, sipping coffee that I didn't have to share, and savoring the quiet hum of life on campus. It was everything I dreamed of when I left Minnesota, and I reveled in it. The stark contrast between my peaceful present and the whirlwind of past holidays was impossible to ignore. I'd catch myself flashing back to Christmas mornings where the noise and demands never seemed to end. The weight of those memories only made me cherish my newfound freedom more. No longer was I the family's default caregiver, the one expected to put her life on hold for everyone else. Here I was just Lily, a college student figuring out her path. But the messages kept coming. At first, I ignored them, letting my phone fill with unread texts and missed calls. The guilt still lingered, but each day it grew quieter. My family, however, grew louder. Mom's texts shifted from polite inquiries to veiled accusations. Jessica's messages were sparse but pointed, laced with her usual condescension. Ashley's were more emotional, pleading for me to call her back. Even Dad sent a rare message, asking if everything was okay. Then, one quiet evening in late January, there was a knock on my dorm door. I opened it to find Mom, Dad, and Ashley standing in the hallway, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. My stomach twisted as I stepped aside to let them in, bracing myself for whatever confrontation lay ahead. Ashley spoke first, her voice cracking as she apologized. She admitted that they'd taken me for granted, that she hadn't realized how much they'd relied on me until I wasn't there anymore. Mom chimed in, her words halting but heartfelt. She talked about how proud she was of me, how she'd failed to show it because she'd been too focused on holding the family together. Even Dad, who rarely spoke about feelings, admitted that he'd underestimated me, that he'd assumed I'd always be there without considering what I might want for myself. It was almost too much to take in. Years of resentment and frustration battled with the flicker of hope their words ignited. But I noticed Jessica's absence. Her lack of acknowledgement felt like a shadow over the moment. When I asked about her, Ashley's face fell. Jessica, it seemed, wasn't ready to admit any fault. She dismissed my decision as selfish, refusing to see how her actions had contributed to my breaking point. Despite Jessica's absence, the conversation felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, I saw my family's humanity, their flaws, and their attempts to mend what had been broken. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. The anger that had fueled me for so long began to fade, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. I didn't forgive them completely that night. Wounds like mine don't heal overnight. But I agreed to stay in touch, to try to rebuild our relationship on my terms. When they left, I felt lighter, as if I'd taken a step toward something better, something healthier. On the drive back to their hotel, Ashley texted me a simple, "Thank you." It wasn't much, but it felt genuine. The days that followed were a mix of cautious optimism and lingering doubts. I didn't unblock Jessica, and I didn't plan to. But I started answering Mom's calls, short conversations where we talked about my classes and her garden. Ashley sent me pictures of her kids' drawings, and for the first time, I found myself smiling at them instead of feeling burdened. By February, I realized that I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. My grades were solid, my friendships were growing deeper, and I was finally living a life that felt like mine. The family dynamic might never be perfect, but I'd carved out a space where I could exist as more than just a daughter or sister. And for now, that was enough. Months later, I found myself back in Minnesota for a weekend visit. It wasn't out of obligation or guilt, but a cautious willingness to see if things had truly changed. The air felt different when I walked through the front door of the house. The usual chaos of children running wild was absent, replaced by a quieter, more controlled energy. Mom greeted me with a warm smile that wasn't weighed down by expectation. Even Dad seemed genuinely happy to see me without immediately pointing to a chore or task he needed help with. The real surprise was Ashley. Over the months, she'd reached out consistently, not to ask for favors, but to genuinely check in. Her messages were short and thoughtful, often asking about my classes or sharing a funny story about her kids. Seeing her in person, I noticed the change in her demeanor. She wasn't frazzled or overwhelmed, but calm and intentional. We spent the afternoon talking over coffee while her kids played quietly in the next room. For the first time, it felt like a relationship built on mutual respect rather than one-sided demands. Jessica, however, was a different story. She hadn't been at the house when I arrived, and Mom quickly explained that she decided to skip the visit. "She's still processing everything," Mom said, her tone tinged with a mix of sadness and frustration. I nodded, but didn't press for details. Jessica's absence wasn't surprising. She'd always struggled to admit when she was wrong, and this situation was no exception. The weekend unfolded with an ease I hadn't expected. Family dinners were less about performance and more about connection. Mom and Dad asked questions about my life without steering the conversation back to my sisters. Ashley and I reminisced about childhood memories without the usual undercurrent of competition. Even the kids seemed to sense the shift, their laughter filling the house without the usual tantrums and meltdowns. On my last night, we all gathered in the living room, the fireplace casting a warm glow over the room. Ashley handed me a photo album she'd put together. Pictures of us growing up, snapshots of milestones I'd forgotten about. There was one photo in particular that caught my attention. The three of us sisters sitting on the front porch, Jessica holding a book, Ashley with a sketch pad, and me clutching a stuffed animal. I couldn't have been more than 5, and the smile on my face was so genuine it made my chest ache. "I miss this," Ashley said softly, breaking the silence. "I know it'll never be perfect, but I want to try. For the kids, for us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. It wasn't a promise to forgive and forget, but it was a start. The tension that had defined our relationship for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but hopeful truce. When I boarded the plane back to California, my thoughts were a whirlwind. The visit had been far from perfect, but it was progress. Jessica's absence left a hole that no amount of family bonding could fill. I wondered if she'd ever be ready to confront her role in the dysfunction, or if she'd continue to keep her distance. The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I knew better than to let it consume me. Back at the university, life moved forward. My classes grew more demanding, my friendships deepened, and my sense of self continued to solidify. I'd built a life that felt true to who I was, one that didn't revolve around meeting others' expectations. The visits home became occasional rather than obligatory, each one reinforcing the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. Yet, Jessica lingered in the back of my mind. Every so often, I'd scroll through my phone, wondering if I should unblock her number, send a text, or make the first move. But each time, I hesitated. Reconciliation, I'd learned, couldn't be forced. It had to come from a place of genuine willingness on both sides. Until Jessica was ready, I'd focus on the relationships that mattered most. Life, I realized, wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about finding balance, about letting go of what no longer served me and holding on to what did. My family would always be a part of me, but I'd finally learned that I could be whole without carrying their burdens. And for the first time, that felt like enough.